Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The orchids were behaving themselves that Tuesday morning, which was more than I could say for the woman sitting across from me in the front room. She had arrived at 10:15 without an appointment, which Wolfe considers roughly equivalent to a declaration of war. Fritz had shown her in with the careful expression he reserves for situations requiring diplomatic neutrality. And I had taken one look at her and decided that whatever she wanted, it was going to cost somebody something considerable. Her name, she had told Fritz at the door, was Constance Verrill. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, though she wore it the way expensive women sometimes do. Not by hiding it, but by making it irrelevant. The suit was charcoal wool, quietly perfect. The pearls were real. The hands folded in her lap were steady. But steadiness in a person who has something urgent to say is its own kind of tension. I introduced myself as Archie Goodwin, which she already knew, because she said, "Yes, I know, you're his legs." "Among other things," I said. "I also answer the phone, maintain the files, drive the car, and occasionally prevent people from shooting each other. Can I offer you coffee while you tell me why you're here?" She accepted the coffee and told me why she was here. And by the time she'd been talking for 4 minutes, I had decided to disturb Wolfe's morning routine, which is saying something. Wolfe spends 9 to 11 and 4 to 6 upstairs in the plant rooms with his 10,000 orchids. And during those hours he is as available as the far side of the moon. Theodore Horseman, his orchid nurse, once told me that a building inspector had come by with a condemnation notice during the morning session, and Wolfe had refused to come down. The building was not condemned. Wolfe's schedule remained intact. This tells you everything you need to know about priorities in the brownstone on West 35th Street. But Constance Verrill's situation had two elements that I knew would snag Wolfe's attention, like a fishhook through silk. The first was money, specifically a great deal of it attached to a dead man. The second was an intellectual problem of the kind that Wolfe cannot encounter without his brain beginning to itch. I excused myself, went to the hall, and used the house phone. "What is it?" Wolfe said. Not a question. With him, it rarely is. "A client," I said. "Constance Verrill. Her husband's business partner was found dead Saturday night in the partner's own gallery on East 64th Street. The police have made an arrest. The arrested man is her husband." A pause. In the background, I could hear the faint mist of the humidity system. "The police have made an arrest," Wolfe repeated, "and she is here on a Tuesday. She believes they have the wrong man. Wives frequently do. She also believes she knows who the right man is, and why, and that if she tells the police, they will ignore her, because it implicates someone with sufficient influence to make ignoring her the path of least resistance." Another pause, longer this time. I waited. "Send her to the office," he said, and hung up. I allowed myself a small moment of satisfaction, then went back to the front room and told Constance Verrill that Mr. Wolfe would see her shortly. She nodded as though this were the natural order of things, which I found interesting. Most people who come to that brownstone are nervous. She was not nervous. She was controlled, which is different, and in my experience, more complicated. Wolfe came down from the plant rooms at 10:43, precisely when he chose to, which was to say, when he had finished what he was doing, and not 1 second earlier. He entered the office, the big room on the ground floor with the bookshelves, the globe, the 2 red chairs for visitors, and his own enormous custom chair behind the desk, and moved to that chair with the careful deliberateness of a man who weighs over 250 pounds, and has made peace with that fact. He did not extend his hand to Constance Verrill. He settled into the chair, which gave its customary protest, folded his hands on his desk, and regarded her. "Mrs. Verrill," he said, "I am Nero Wolfe. You have told Mr. Goodwin that your husband has been arrested for the murder of his business partner. Tell me the rest." She set down her coffee cup. "The dead man is Elliot Marsh. He and my husband, Douglas Verrill, have been partners in Verrill Marsh Gallery for 11 years. Elliot was found dead in the gallery's back office at approximately 10 o'clock Saturday evening by the building's night security guard. He had been struck on the head with a bronze statuette, one of the pieces from inventory, and died from the injury. The police arrested Douglas the following morning. On what grounds? Douglas and Elliot had argued publicly the week before, at the opening for a new exhibition. Several people witnessed it. Douglas left the gallery angry. Elliot apparently told people afterward that he intended to dissolve the partnership. And, she paused for the first time, a small hesitation that I noted and filed. Douglas cannot account for his whereabouts between 8 and 11 Saturday evening. Where does he say he was? He says he was driving, that he needed to think and drove north along the river, alone. Wolfe's expression did not change. A classically unfortunate alibi. Where was the gallery when the body was discovered? Closed. The exhibition opening had been the previous Tuesday. Normal gallery hours are 10 to 6. Saturday evening it should have been empty. The security guard does a round of the building at 10. He found Elliot in the back office, the door slightly ajar. Who has access to the gallery after hours? Douglas, Elliot, and their gallery manager, a woman named Petra Holt. There's also a code for the main door, a 4-digit entry code. Known to whom? Douglas, Elliot, Petra, and, the second hesitation more significant than the first, a man named Raymond Crail. Wolfe's eyes, which had been resting on her with the steady patience of a man doing arithmetic, sharpened by a fraction. And who is Raymond Crail? A collector, one of the gallery's most important patrons. Over the past 3 years, he has purchased. She opened the small bag in her lap and produced a folded sheet of paper, approximately $400,000 worth of art through Verrill Marsh. He and Elliot became personally close. Elliot gave him the door code as a courtesy. Raymond would sometimes come in after hours to view new acquisitions privately before they were shown to other buyers. A substantial privilege, Wolfe said. Raymond Crail is a man who expects substantial privileges, she said, and usually receives them. I had been at my desk with my notepad, doing what I do, watching and recording. I wrote down Raymond Crail, privilege access, and drew a small box around it, which is my private notation for, this matters. You suggested to Mr. Goodwin, Wolfe said, that you believe someone other than your husband is responsible, and that this person has sufficient influence to make the police disinclined to look in his direction. You are referring to Crail. Yes. Why? She uncrossed and recrossed her ankles, which was the first physical indication of difficulty I'd seen from her. 3 weeks ago, Douglas came home troubled. He told me that Elliot had discovered something about Raymond's purchases, a pattern of some kind. Douglas was vague, deliberately I think because he hadn't yet decided what to do about it. But he used the word fraud. I pressed him, and he said only that Elliot was considering whether to go to certain authorities. Art fraud, Wolfe said. Specifically? I don't know. Douglas wouldn't say more. 2 days later he told me he'd spoken to Elliot and that the matter was being handled, and that I should forget he'd mentioned it. I tried to. But you didn't. No. Because a week after that came the argument at the opening. And now Elliot is dead. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck moved down 35th Street with the indifferent noise of the city going about its business. Fritz appeared at the door, caught my eye, and I shook my head slightly. He withdrew. Mrs. Verrill, Wolfe said, you have presented me with a suggestive sequence of events and an inference, but nothing that constitutes evidence. The police, if presented with this, would note that your husband knew of the alleged fraud, argued with the victim, and lacks an alibi. They would be unmoved by your theory, and not necessarily due to Crail's influence. I know that, she said. What precisely do you want from me? She looked at him steadily. I want you to find what Elliot found, whatever it was about Raymond Crail's purchases. If it exists, it will exist somewhere, in the gallery's records, in correspondence, in Elliot's private papers. And if it exists, it provides Raymond Crail with a motive, that the police cannot ignore, regardless of his influence. Wolfe looked at her for a long moment. Then he unfolded his hands, which is one of his signals, the equivalent of another man leaning forward. Your husband's attorney, has he been engaged? Saul Featherstone, yes. Good man, Wolfe said, which from him constitutes an enthusiastic endorsement. He will manage the immediate legal situation. I will require a complete list of the gallery's significant clients over the past 4 years, with particular attention to Crail's transactions. I will require access to any records you can obtain through your husband's authority as co-owner. I will require the names of all persons who were present at the exhibition opening when the argument occurred. And I will require you to tell me, before you leave this office, what you are not telling me. Constance Verrill blinked. It was a small blink, quickly controlled, but I caught it, and I suspected Wolfe did too. I beg your pardon? You paused twice when you might not have, Wolfe said pleasantly. Both times when the information you were about to disclose was unfavorable. You are an intelligent woman who prepared carefully for this meeting. Preparation of that kind does not produce inadvertent pauses. The pauses were therefore deliberate. Moments where you chose how much to reveal. There is something more. I would prefer to have it now, rather than encounter it later in a context less favorable to your interests. The silence stretched. I watched Constance Verrill decide something. You can sometimes see it happen, a small internal adjustment, like a door swinging on a hinge. Douglas and Elliot's argument at the opening, she said. It was not only about the business, there was a personal element. Elliot had been involved with a woman for approximately a year. Douglas knew about the involvement and disapproved, strongly. The woman is someone who moves in the same circles as Raymond Crail. Her name is Diana Ashworth. I wrote it down. Diana Ashworth, Elliot's involvement, Crail connection. Douglas disapproved because the relationship was inappropriate? Wolfe asked. Douglas disapproved because he believed Diana Ashworth was using Elliot, cultivating him for information about clients, about acquisitions, about the financial workings of the gallery. He believed she was doing so on someone else's behalf. Crail's behalf. Then, my fee is substantial. The retainer is $10,000 against a final accounting. If I produce the result you want, there will be an additional fee commensurate with the result. If I conclude that your husband is in fact guilty, I will tell you so, and you will owe me only the retainer. I understand, she said, without hesitation. The lack of hesitation told me the money was not the issue. Very well. Wolfe pressed the buzzer for Fritz. Mr. Goodwin will take down the names and preliminary information. We will begin today. When Constance Verrill left at 11:40, I sat back and looked at my notes. A dead art dealer, a partner in custody with no alibi, and a public argument on record. A wealthy collector with suspicious purchase patterns and convenient access to the crime scene. A woman who may have been spying through a romantic attachment. And a victim who had apparently found something worth killing him to keep quiet. Wolfe had returned to his desk and was already reaching for his current book, a thick volume on Byzantine economic history that had been occupying him for a week. But before he opened it, he said without looking up, Archie, right here. Raymond Crail, find out everything publicly available before this afternoon, and find out who Diana Ashworth is and whose company she keeps. Anything else? He opened the book. Ensure Fritz knows I want the duck with cherries this evening. This case will require sustained attention, and I intend to be adequately fortified. Outside the brownstone, the city hummed and pushed and moved, indifferent to the fact that somewhere in its steel and glass indifference, a man had been killed, another man was sitting in a cell for it, and Nero Wolfe had just decided to find out the truth. In my experience, that last fact was the one that mattered. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I had assembled what the internet and a few phone calls could produce on Raymond Crail, which was simultaneously a great deal and very little. The great deal, Raymond Crail, 57, was the founder and principal of Crail Capital Management, a private investment firm operating out of a midtown address, with the kind of understatement that signals serious money. No flashy logo, no street-level presence, just a floor in a building where other floors were occupied by law firms and private equity groups. He had been written about in the financial press with the respectful vagueness reserved for men whose operations are profitable and opaque. He sat on the boards of 2 cultural institutions, had donated to a hospital wing and a university library, and was photographed at charity events with the regularity of a man who understands that visibility in the right rooms is its own form of currency. The very little. What Raymond Crail actually did with other people's money, and how he had come to have so much of his own, was the kind of information that does not appear in public filings or society columns. Diana Ashworth was easier, in a different way. She was 38, a consultant, the word appearing in her public biography with the generous vagueness of someone who does consulting of an undefined nature for clients who are never named. She appeared in photographs with Crail at 2 events in the past year. She was attractive in the way that photographs with captions tend to emphasize, and she had an address in a building on East 72nd Street that suggested her consulting was well compensated. I brought this to Wolfe at 2:30, when he had come down from the afternoon orchid session and settled in with coffee. I also brought the list Constance Verrill had messaged through her attorney, the names of clients present at the gallery opening the prior Tuesday, and the names of Verrill Marsh's significant buyers over 4 years. Wolfe read everything I put in front of him, which he does with the focused efficiency of a machine designed for the purpose. Then he set it down. "We will see them here," he said. "Arrange it." "All of them?" "Petra Holt first. She manages the gallery, and will know its internal workings. Then the others as they can be persuaded." Persuading people to come to Wolfe's office is a substantial part of my professional life. I have developed approaches ranging from the formally courteous to the subtly ominous, depending on the individual. For Petra Holt, gallery manager, I called the gallery's main number and left a message explaining that I was assisting in a private investigation related to the death of Elliot Marsh, and that Mr. Wolfe would appreciate her time at her earliest convenience. She called back in 20 minutes and agreed to come the next morning at 10. Either she was cooperative by nature, or she had something she wanted to say. In my experience, when witnesses call back quickly, it's usually the latter. Raymond Crail was another matter. I called the number for Crail Capital Management, and was passed through a sequence of assistants with the efficiency of a well-maintained bureaucracy. The last assistant, a man with the polished tone of someone hired specifically to say no pleasantly, informed me that Mr. Crail's schedule was fully committed for the foreseeable future. I explained that we were conducting a private investigation into a matter that touched on Mr. Crail's relationship with Elliot Marsh and Verrill Marsh Gallery, and that Mr. Wolfe hoped to speak with him before the matter was discussed with the police. Crail himself came on the line 30 seconds later. "I can come Thursday afternoon," he said, without preamble. His voice was measured and even, the voice of a man who maintains his equilibrium as a professional discipline. "Thursday at 3, I said. "Fine." He hung up. Fast agreement from a man insulated by assistance. I noted that too. Diana Ashworth I reached through her listed business number. She was guarded, precise, and asked twice what specifically I wanted to discuss. I was pleasantly vague. She agreed to come Thursday morning, which left me with Wednesday and Petra Holt, and the prospect of a visit to the gallery itself, which I had already scheduled for that afternoon, with the blessing of Constance Verrill's attorney, who had confirmed that Douglas Verrill's co-ownership gave his wife's representative access to the business records. The gallery occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on East 64th Street between Madison and Park. The neighborhood is the kind where galleries, discreet restaurants, and the offices of professionals who cater to the very wealthy coexist with the mutual understanding that no one shouts and everyone parks legally. A small bronze plaque beside the door read Verrill Marsh in letters designed to be found only by those already looking. Inside, the space was cool, hushed, and lit with the careful precision of a room where the light is itself a design decision. The current exhibition, still up despite everything, because exhibitions have logistics that don't pause for murder, was a collection of mid-century American paintings, each on its own wall with the breathing room that expensive art demands. Petra Holt met me near the reception desk. She was 40 or thereabouts, with the particular kind of composure that comes from spending years managing expensive objects and the people who want them. Medium height, dark hair pulled back, clothes that were professional without being corporate. She shook my hand with the directness of someone who has decided to be cooperative and wants credit for the decision. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "I spoke with Mrs. Verrill this morning. I want to help if I can." "I appreciate that. Can we speak somewhere private?" She led me to the back office, which I entered with the specific awareness that this was where Elliot Marsh had died 4 days ago. The police had released it after processing. There was nothing visibly different about the room. A desk, bookshelves lined with auction catalogs and reference volumes, a filing cabinet, a small conversation area with 2 chairs. The bronze statuette that had killed Elliot Marsh was presumably in a police evidence room. There was a faint square of absence on one of the shelves where something had stood. I did not mention it. Petra Holt glanced at the shelf once and looked away. "Tell me about the argument at the opening," I said, "between Douglas and Elliot." She settled into one of the chairs with the careful posture of someone who has been thinking about what to say. "It started quietly. They went into the storage room. That's through that door. And the door wasn't entirely closed. I was near it, not eavesdropping, but near it. I heard Douglas say something about Raymond, something about what Elliot was doing being dangerous. Elliot said Douglas didn't understand the art market and never had. Then it got louder. Elliot said something about the partnership being done, and Douglas came out looking, not angry exactly, frightened. "Frightened," I repeated. "Not angry. Frightened." I thought about it afterward. It seemed like the wrong reaction for someone who'd just been told the business was ending. I agreed with her assessment, which I didn't say. "What was Elliot's relationship with Raymond Crail like, from your observation?" "Close. Unusually close for a dealer-patron relationship." She chose her words with care. Raymond would come in after hours. Elliot had given him the code, which I wasn't entirely comfortable with. They'd spend an hour, sometimes 2, looking at new acquisitions. Elliot treated him differently from other clients. More deference than I'd seen from him before. "Did Crail's purchases seem normal to you?" A pause that was more careful than the others. "Define normal. In your professional judgment, as someone who manages the gallery's operations." "Raymond bought well," she said. "His eye is good, or he had someone advising him. But there were patterns I didn't always understand. He would purchase something and then, within months, that same piece would appear at auction. Sometimes at significantly higher prices, attributed to different provenance. I mentioned it to Elliot once. He told me Raymond was a sophisticated collector who understood market cycles." A beat. I didn't entirely believe him. Art flipping with altered provenance. That was one reading of it. There were others, none of them clean. I made a mental note to ask Wolfe about the specific mechanisms of art market fraud, which is the sort of thing he knows, because he knows everything that interests him and a great deal that doesn't. "Diana Ashworth," I said, "what can you tell me?" Petra's expression shifted in a way I filed carefully. Not hostility, something more complicated. She came to several events, as Elliot's guest. She was, a very brief pause, charming. Very good at finding out what people do, and how they do it. She asked me quite detailed questions about the gallery's operations at one of the openings. I assumed it was curiosity. But she asked the kind of specific questions that don't come from curiosity. They come from purpose. That was well put, and I told her so. She looked slightly pleased and slightly sad, which told me she had respected Elliot Marsh professionally, even if she had worried about his judgment personally. Before I left, I spent 40 minutes with the gallery's financial records, the files that Constance's attorney had cleared me to access. I am not an accountant, and Wolfe is not an accountant. But you do not need to be an accountant to see that Raymond Crail had purchased 23 works through Verrill Marsh over 3 years, and that the documentation on 11 of those works contained certain irregularities in the provenance chains that even my untrained eye found odd. Certificates of authenticity from institutions I didn't recognize. Previous sale records with sellers who were listed as estates, but with no corresponding probate documentation. I photographed everything with my phone, and left the gallery at 5:30, with the feeling of a man who has tugged a thread, and felt something substantial shift on the other end. The next morning, Petra Holt arrived at the brownstone at exactly 10 o'clock, which suggested she was punctual by principle. Fritz brought her into the office, where Wolfe had positioned himself behind his desk with the settled authority of a judge who has already read the case file. I made introductions. Wolfe thanked her for coming with the formal courtesy he applies to witnesses he considers intelligent and potentially useful. She took the red chair, noted the orchids on Wolfe's desk, and made a brief comment about the cattleya on the corner shelf, which was accurate and specific enough that Wolfe's expression warmed by a measurable degree. Orchids will do that. He took her through the same territory I had covered, but differently, not covering ground but excavating it. His questions are not my questions. I ask what happened. Wolfe asks what it meant, and then he asks why it meant that, and then he asks what the person telling him has concluded from what it meant. And somewhere in that sequence, the interesting material emerges. From Petra Holt, under Wolfe's specific pressure, several things emerged that she had not told me. The first, 3 weeks before the opening, Elliot Marsh had asked her to pull the complete transaction files on all of Crail's purchases, going back to the first one. He had taken them to his office and spent an evening with them, and the following morning had been visibly agitated. He had told her to return the files and say nothing about the request. The second, the week of the opening, a man she did not recognize had come to the gallery during business hours, spoken briefly with Elliot in his office, and left. Elliot afterward had been, in her word, shaken. She had not thought to mention this to the police because they had not asked the right questions. Describe the man, Wolfe said. 50 or so. Compact, not large, but with the look of someone who is stronger than he appears. Very short hair, almost a military cut. He wore a coat that was good quality, but not the kind of quality our usual visitors wear. He spoke with Elliot for perhaps 10 minutes. When he left, he did not look at me. He walked out as if I wasn't there. And Elliot's reaction after this man left? He came to the door of his office and asked me if I was going anywhere for lunch. I said I had thought about going to the place on 63rd. He asked me if I would mind going somewhere else instead, getting a bit of air. He said it with... She stopped. He said it the way you say something when you want the other person to leave, without explaining why. She paused, and then she added, I've thought about it since. I think he was frightened. I think the man who came was not a collector. Wolfe thanked her, and she left. When the door had closed, he sat for a moment in the particular stillness he adopts when his mind is running at speed. Archie. Yes. The man who visited Elliot Marsh. Not a collector, not an attorney, not a business contact in any conventional sense. A man who walks out of rooms as if people are not in them. He picked up his coffee. Someone sent him. To threaten Marsh? To assess him. To determine whether Marsh was going to act on what he'd found. He set the cup down. Someone learned that Marsh had been reviewing Crail's transaction files. That someone wanted to know what Marsh intended to do about what he'd found. And a week later, Marsh is dead, I said. Yes. Wolfe opened his book. Thursday will be interesting. I looked at my notes. Diana Ashworth in the morning. Raymond Crail in the afternoon. Two people who between them might hold the shape of what Elliot Marsh had found, and what it had cost him. Outside, the city went about its business. Up in the plant rooms, 10,000 orchids bloomed in their controlled and temperate world, indifferent to fraud and murder and the slow assembly of truth. I went to make phone calls. The medical examiner's report on Elliot Marsh, which I obtained through a contact at the precinct who owes me a favor I have been careful not to overuse, contains several things worth noting, and one thing worth noting more than the rest. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the posterior skull, consistent with the bronze statuette, a 12-inch figure of a standing horse, that had been found wiped and replaced on the shelf. One blow, forceful and precisely placed, which the ME noted was consistent with either a single lucky strike or someone who knew what they were doing. Marsh had died quickly, probably within minutes. Time of death was estimated between 8 and 10 Saturday evening, which bracketed the period during which Douglas Verrill could not account for himself, and during which the gallery should have been empty. The thing worth noting more than the rest, there were no signs of forced entry. The front door had been opened with the correct code. Whoever killed Elliot Marsh had walked in with the key, metaphorically speaking, and Marsh had apparently either not been alarmed by their arrival or had not had time to become alarmed. Which meant the killer was either Douglas Verrill, Petra Holt, Raymond Crail, or someone else to whom Elliot Marsh had given the door code. People who are not alarmed by arrivals are people they know and trust, or at minimum, know. A stranger with the code would still be a stranger. I brought this analysis to Wolfe over breakfast, my breakfast. He eats in his room and comes down at 9 in a state of prepared civility. The absence of alarm, he said, settling into his chair with the deliberate care of a large man who respects furniture. Yes, Marsh was comfortable with whoever arrived, either because he knew them or because he had arranged the meeting. You think he might have set it up himself? A man who has discovered evidence of fraud, who has been visited by an ambiguous and unsettling stranger, and who has argued publicly with his partner, might very reasonably decide to meet privately with someone to resolve the situation. The question is whether that resolution was his intention or only his hope. I thought about Petra Holt's description of Elliot Marsh after the stranger's visit. Shaken, asking her to leave. The behavior of a man managing something he had not yet decided how to handle. He might have called the meeting himself, I said, reached out to whoever was behind it, and proposed a conversation. And the other party arrived with a different kind of resolution in mind, which suggests the killer came prepared, or came in anger. Anger and preparation are not mutually exclusive. He picked up his coffee. What time is Miss Ashworth expected? 10:30. And Crail at 3. We will also need to speak with Douglas Verrill. His attorney should arrange it. I'll call Featherstone. Diana Ashworth arrived at 10:34, which told me she was either intentionally a few minutes late or uninterested in appearing eager. She was, in person, the kind of attractive that photographs underrepresent. Not because the photographs were inadequate, but because the quality that made her effective in a room was movement and attention, neither of which photographs capture. She came in with the alert stillness of a person who notices everything, while appearing to notice only what is directly in front of her. She wore a coat that she did not remove when Fritz offered, which is a negotiating posture, keeping the option to leave easily visible. I showed her to the red chair, and she sat in it with a careful grace. Wolfe regarded her. Miss Ashworth, he said, thank you for coming. I will be direct with you, because directness saves time, and I find I have less patience for its alternative than I once did. You were in a personal relationship with Elliot Marsh for approximately 12 months prior to his death. You are acquainted with Raymond Crail. I am investigating Marsh's murder, on behalf of Douglas Verrill's wife. I would like you to tell me about the intersection of those three things. She looked at him for a moment. You frame it as an intersection. It might simply be coincidence. It might, Wolfe agreed pleasantly, but it isn't. Shall we proceed? Another moment. Then something shifted, not a dramatic shift, but the kind of recalibration that happens when a person decides that the posture they've prepared is not going to serve them. Elliot and I met at a benefit 18 months ago, she said. We became involved. It was, she chose the word, genuine from my side. I want to be clear about that. And from his side? Also genuine, I believe. Though Elliot was a man who compartmentalized. There were parts of his life he kept separate from other parts, including his professional concerns. He rarely talked about the gallery in detail, general things, upcoming exhibitions, clients he liked or found difficult, but not, she paused, not the financial side, not the business mechanics. Did Raymond Crail introduce you to Marsh, or vice versa? The pause before her answer was small but measurable. Crail and I have known each other for several years, professionally. When I met Elliot and mentioned to Raymond that we'd become acquainted, he expressed interest. What kind of interest? He asked if Elliot ever talked about the gallery's operations, the client relationships, how purchases were documented. She said it flatly, without decoration. I told Raymond that Elliot was discreet, which was true. Did Crail ask you to gather specific information through your relationship with Marsh? She sat with that for a moment. He suggested it would be useful. I declined. Wolfe said nothing. That particular silence of his is a tool. He waited. I declined, she repeated. And I told Elliot about the conversation, about what Raymond had asked. That was unexpected. I kept my face neutral and wrote it down. Marsh's response? Wolfe asked. He was not surprised exactly. Thoughtful. He said he'd wondered about some things, and then he went quiet, and I could see he was turning something over, and that he wasn't going to talk about it, so I let it go. When did this conversation occur? Approximately 5 weeks ago. 5 weeks before his death. Did you and Marsh discuss Crail again after that? Once, about 2 weeks ago. Elliot called me, not to meet, just called, and asked me whether I knew specifically what kind of information Crail had wanted. I told him I thought it was to do with documentation, provenance records, certifications. He thanked me and rang off. She looked at her hands, which were quiet in her lap. That was the last time we spoke. You did not attend the opening the following week. I was in Chicago, a client engagement. She looked up. I know how this looks. My connection to Crail. The timing of Elliot's questions. I am not unaware. Wolfe asked, what does it look like, in your assessment? It looks like Elliot had found something about Raymond's purchases that he was going to act on, and that Raymond may have known he was going to act on it, and that I am connected to both of them. She said it steadily. I did not tell Raymond what Elliot said in that last phone call. I want you to believe that. Belief is a large ask, Wolfe said. Evidence is preferable. Is there anything that might support what you've told me? She opened her bag and produced a phone. The call logs, showing Elliot's call to me and its duration. And she found what she was looking for. A message I sent Raymond after Elliot and I spoke 5 weeks ago. I told him I wasn't going to be useful to him in the way he'd hoped, and that he should find another avenue. She held out the phone. I took it, photographed the screen, the message clearly dated, and handed it back. Wolfe looked at me. I gave him a small nod. Thank you, Miss Ashworth, he said. I may need to speak with you again. I'll be available. She stood, and this time she unbuttoned the coat before Fritz appeared, which told me she'll revise her exit strategy somewhere in the middle of the conversation. When she was gone, I swiveled in my chair. She told Marsh about Crail's ask, I said. That's what prompted Marsh to pull the transaction files. She's the reason he started looking. Yes, Wolfe said, and Crail likely knew that Marsh had been told, because Marsh's behavior changed after she declined. Marsh became more cautious, began reviewing records, eventually argued with Varel about what he'd found. The behavior of a man building toward a decision. He drummed 2 fingers on the desk. Someone told Crail that Marsh was moving toward action. And someone dispatched the man who visited the gallery. So Crail has people, I said. Crail has resources, which is not quite the same thing, but is often indistinguishable in practice. I looked at the clock. He's here in 4 hours. Yes, Wolfe reached for his book. I suggest lunch before then. I find that confronting men of Crail's type is best done on a full stomach. Fritz, as always, obliged magnificently. A cold poached salmon with a dill sauce that deserved a longer appreciation than the clock allowed. By 2:30 I had cleared the desk, refreshed my notepad, and settled in with the particular alertness I maintain when Wolfe is about to do what he does best. Raymond Crail arrived at 3 o'clock exactly. Raymond Crail was a man designed to be underestimated, which meant he had long since stopped worrying about whether he was underestimated. He was compact. Petra Holt's description had been accurate, with close-cropped gray hair and the contained physical economy of someone who had been, at some point, in an environment that rewarded efficiency of movement. He wore a suit that was impeccable and anonymous. He looked at Wolfe's office with the brief, assessing glance of a man who catalogs rooms the way other people check the weather, and then he sat in the red chair as if he had sat in it before. He had not, of course, but the effect was of a man who is never in a strange room. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "I was sorry to hear about Elliot. He was an excellent dealer, and I thought a friend." "The combination is rare," Wolfe said. "In my experience, professional and personal regard frequently compromise each other." Crail smiled slightly. "In mine as well, but Elliot managed it." "Tell me about the last time you saw him." "The opening. 3 weeks ago. We spoke briefly. The room was full. He seemed in good spirits. Despite the argument with his partner. I wasn't aware of any argument." Wolfe looked at him with the placid certainty of a man holding cards he hasn't yet chosen to show. "You were present at the opening. The argument between Marsh and Varel occurred in the storage room. You were not in the storage room, but the opening was not large. Miss Holt heard it from the floor. Others certainly noted its aftermath. Varel left visibly agitated. You saw none of this?" "I may have noticed some tension between them. I didn't know the cause." "Did you ask?" "It wasn't my business." "No," Wolfe agreed, "but you were close enough to Elliot Marsh to have been given the door code to his gallery, to meet him there after hours, to be characterized by people who knew him as an unusually intimate patron. A man in that position might naturally inquire about his friend's evident distress." Crail was quiet for a moment. "I didn't want to intrude." Wolfe picked up a pen from his desk and set it down again, which is one of his methods of appearing to do something while doing nothing, which gives witnesses the vague sense of activity without its content. "Mr. Crail, I am not a policeman and I have not the authority or the inclination to compel your answers. You came here voluntarily and may leave at any time. I raise this not as a courtesy, but as a context. Men who come voluntarily and answer carefully generally do so because they have calculated that cooperation, managed carefully, is preferable to its alternative. I find that calculation usually sound. It assumes, however, that the manager of the cooperation has accurately assessed what I know." Crail regarded him. "And you're suggesting my assessment may be inaccurate?" "I'm noting the possibility." Another pause. Longer. Crail looked at me. Briefly, assessing what I was, probably concluding I was the note-taker and audience, which was correct and incomplete. Then he looked back at Wolfe. "What do you know?" he asked. "I know that 11 of the 23 works you purchased through Varel Marsh contain irregularities in their provenance documentation. I know that Elliot Marsh reviewed your complete transaction files 3 weeks before his death and was visibly disturbed by what he found. I know that within days of that review, a man visited the gallery, compact, short-haired, with the bearing of someone in a professional capacity that is not artistic, and spoke with Marsh privately for 10 minutes, after which Marsh sent his gallery manager away. I know that Marsh asked Diana Ashworth, specifically, about the nature of the information you had sought through her. He folded his hands. I know that Douglas Verrill argued with Marsh not merely about the business, but about danger, the specific word used. And I know that Marsh is dead, and Verrill is in custody, and that the question of who sent the man to the gallery is, at this moment, unanswered by anyone who will say it aloud. The room was quiet. Outside, a car horn resolved and dissolved. Crail sat very still. Then, "You've been thorough." "I try to be. What I do with acquisitions after purchase is entirely legal," Crail said. "Art investment is a legitimate strategy. Values fluctuate. Legitimate art investment does not require provenance documents from institutions that do not appear to exist," Wolfe said mildly. Crail's jaw moved slightly, the barest tightening. "I don't personally prepare provenance documentation." "No, but you benefit from it, and benefit in law and in logic creates interest." Wolfe leaned back. "I am not the police, Mr. Crail, and I am not a prosecutor. I am trying to determine who killed Elliot Marsh. If your answer is that you do not know and had no involvement, tell me so, and tell me what you do know. If your answer is more complicated, I suggest you consider that a complicated answer, given to me now, is substantially less damaging than the same answer given later in a context you control less." A long silence. Crail looked at a point somewhere between himself and Wolfe's desk, doing arithmetic. "I use the gallery as part of a larger structure," he said finally. "The provenance documentation is prepared by a third party. I don't ask questions about how it's prepared. That's a legal problem I was aware of as a risk." "Art fraud," I said from my desk. Crail looked at me. "A strong characterization. Is it inaccurate?" He didn't answer that. Back to Wolfe. "Marsh found the irregularities and intended to report them. To the FBI, I believe. There's a specific unit for art crime. He contacted me. We agreed to meet." Wolfe was very still. "When?" "Saturday evening. At the gallery. I was going to explain the situation and—" He stopped. "Propose a remedy," Wolfe finished. "A financial one, presumably." "Yes." "Did you attend that meeting?" "No." He said it flatly. "I did not go to the gallery Saturday evening. I was at a dinner in Westchester that began at 7, and at which I can produce 12 witnesses. I have not told the police this, because I did not want to explain why I was supposed to meet Marsh. But someone went in your place." The silence that followed was of a different quality. Crail looked at Wolfe with the expression of a man who has arrived at the edge of something and is recalculating the cost of going further. "I don't know who went to the gallery Saturday evening," he said. "I was not there. I sent no one." "And the man who visited the gallery 3 weeks ago?" Very slowly. "I asked someone to assess the situation, to determine how serious Marsh's intentions were." "His name?" "I won't give you that." "Then give me this. Was this person capable of violence?" Crail looked at him steadily. "Most people are, given sufficient reason." Wolfe nodded once, slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already decided. "You may go, Mr. Crail. I expect the police will wish to speak with you shortly about your Westchester alibi, which I suggest you make available to them proactively." Crail stood. He looked for just a moment, like a man who has said more than he intended, and is not yet certain what the cost will be. Then the composure settled back into place, and he walked out with the same contained economy he had walked in with. I waited until the front door closed. "He didn't do it," I said. "No," Wolfe agreed. "He did not. But the man he sent to assess Marsh may have had his own reasons to act, or may have received instructions from someone who understood that Marsh had to be silenced, and that the approaching meeting made Saturday the natural moment. Someone who knew about the meeting. Someone who knew about the meeting, and who had interests that went beyond Crail's. He sat forward. "Archie, I need to speak with Douglas Verrill. Tomorrow morning if Featherstone can arrange it. I'll call him now. and I need you to find out everything about the man who visited the gallery. Compact, military bearing, walked out without looking at people. That's a profile. It belongs to someone. I picked up the phone. The afternoon light through the windows was going amber and long. Somewhere in the machinery of what we'd assembled, something was turning toward a shape I could almost see. Almost. Featherstone arranged it for 9 the next morning at the detention facility, which meant I was up at 7 and out the door with coffee, which is not my preferred sequence, but is sometimes necessary in the service of justice and client fees. Douglas Verrill was 51, and the 3 days he'd spent in custody had done to him what custody does to men unaccustomed to it. Not broken him, but removed certain insulations between him and his own anxiety. He was a lean man with the careful grooming of someone to whom appearance had always been professional currency. But the grooming was beginning to slip at the edges. He sat across from me in the visitor's room with Featherstone beside him, and looked at me with the desperation of a man who is intelligent enough to understand exactly how bad his situation is. I told him who I was, and who I worked for, and that his wife had engaged Nero Wolfe. The desperation shifted into something more complicated. Hope, mixed with the particular shame of a man who knows his wife is fighting for him. Tell me about the night Elliot was killed, I said. Not the official version. Tell me what actually happened. He looked at Featherstone, who nodded minimally. I knew about the meeting, he said. Elliot told me he was going to meet Crail at the gallery Saturday evening. He told me Crail was going to offer money to make the whole thing go away. He asked me if I thought he should take it. What did you tell him? I told him no. I told him taking money from Crail to overlook fraud made us complicit in what had already been done. I told him we should go to the authorities. He rubbed his face. We argued about it. Elliot said it was his decision, that he was the one who'd found it, that he would handle it the way he judged best. And Saturday evening, I drove to the gallery. I don't know exactly what I was going to do. Talk to Elliot before the meeting, convince him not to take the offer. He stopped. I got there at about 8:15. There was a light in the back. The front door was locked. I used my key. I went to the back office and... He stopped again. His hands had gone flat on the table. Elliot was already dead, he said quietly. The room was very still. You found him, I said. Yes. And you left. Yes. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds, and I know I should have called the police, and I couldn't make myself do it. I left, and I drove north along the river, and I drove for hours trying to think of what to do, and by the time I came home the next morning, the police were already there. Was anyone else in the gallery when you arrived? Not that I saw. There were no other cars on the street that I noticed. The back door, the delivery entrance, was ajar. I assumed that was how they'd left. They, I said. Whoever killed him. He looked at me. It wasn't Crail. Crail wouldn't do something like that himself. There'd be someone. The man who came to the gallery 3 weeks ago, compact short hair, military bearing. Verrill went very still. You know about him. Petra Holt described him. Do you know who he is? No. Elliot told me about the visit. He was frightened by it. He didn't know who the man was or who'd sent him, but we both assumed Crail. He paused. There was one thing. Elliot said the man had told him, at the end of the conversation as he was leaving, that there were other interests involved beyond Crail's. That Elliot should understand the situation was larger than one collector. Other interests. Did Elliot say what he understood that to mean? He thought it meant organized money. That Crail was the visible end of something with more behind it. Art fraud at that scale, moving pieces with false provenance, inflating values, it's a money laundering mechanism. He said it steadily, with the knowledge of someone who had been in the art business long enough to know its shadows. Crail may be a beneficiary as much as an architect. I thought about that on the drive back. Crail as the front end of something larger, which would mean that when Marsh decided to go to the FBI, the threat was not just to Crail but to whoever was behind Crail. and that whoever was behind Krail had resources and motivation that Krail might not fully control. I spent the rest of the morning on the compact man with the military bearing. My contact at the precinct, who had given me the ME report, could not help me with this one. But I have other contacts, assembled over years of doing Wolfe's outside work, and one of them, a man who operates in the gray space between private security and things I don't ask about, knew, after I described the profile and mentioned the connection to Krail Capital Management, exactly who I meant. His name, according to my contact, was likely Decker. First name unknown, possibly unused. He appeared in certain circles as a consultant, available for assessments and related work. He had a history in intelligence work, domestically. He was connected, loosely, to a network of financial interests that operated through several investment structures, one of which had known overlaps with Krail Capital Management's investment pool. My contact stopped there, which is where my contacts always stop when the territory gets uncomfortable. But he had given me something. I also spent an hour with the art fraud question, specifically looking at who stood behind the kind of operation Varel had described. Money laundering through art is not new. It's a mechanism that works because art valuation is subjective, the market is opaque, and international movement of pieces is difficult to track. Large-scale operations typically involve multiple galleries, multiple false provenance chains, and multiple layers of financial structure. What I found, working through the gallery's records and the transaction histories I'd photographed, suggested that the pieces Krail had purchased and subsequently moved had not simply been flipped at auction. Some had been sold to a holding company called Meridian Cultural Assets, which was registered in Delaware and had no web presence beyond a single filing. Meridian, as best I could trace, was connected through two intermediate entities to a fund that appeared in Krail Capital Management's investment documents as a passive investor. Which is the kind of structure that means nothing unless you know what it means, in which case it means that Krail was not the top of the chain. He was a sophisticated middle. I brought all of this back to Wolfe at 4 o'clock and laid it out while he sat with the afternoon coffee that Fritz produces at 3:45 with the reliability of a natural phenomenon. He listened without interrupting, which he does when what he's hearing is significant. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Douglas Verrill found Marsh's body, he said. He did not kill him. No. His presence at the gallery, arriving after the killer had left, explains his behavior, his lack of alibi, and his failure to report what he found. A man who discovers his partner's body and flees has done something shameful and legally problematic, but not murder. The police aren't going to like hearing that he was there and didn't report it. No, but Featherstone will manage the legal dimensions. What matters is that Verrill's account is consistent with the evidence, the back door ajar, the time of death, the absence of other vehicles. He picked up his coffee. Decker. If that is indeed the man, he was sent to assess Marsh. The question is whether he was also sent Saturday evening, and by whom. Krail says he didn't send anyone Saturday. Krail says. But if Krail is himself a middle, then those above him also knew about the meeting Saturday, knew that Marsh was going to make a decision, knew that the meeting represented the last moment before Marsh went to the authorities, and acted independently of Krail, or through resources Krail shares without controlling. He set down the cup. I need one more thing, Archie. Find out who Meridian Cultural Assets connects to, above Krail. There will be an individual. There always is at the top of these structures. A name. I'll try, I said. That's deep water. Yes, but the shape of the solution is becoming clear, and that name is the last piece of it. He picked up his book. I picked up my phone. Upstairs, the orchids grew in their temperate certainty. Below them in the city, the truth was taking shape, slower than murder, as it always is, but inexorable. Saturday, 1 week after Elliot Marsh had been struck down in his own gallery, Wolfe did not go up to the plant rooms in the afternoon. This is significant. When Wolfe changes his schedule voluntarily, something is happening in his head that takes priority over his orchids. which is a category with very few members. I have seen it happen 5 times in the years I have worked for him. Each time, the case had reached the stage where the pattern was assembled, and what remained was the final fitting of the pieces. He sat in the office after lunch, with the orchid from his desk, a Miltoniopsis with dark red petals, transferred to the windowsill where the light was better, and worked through the materials spread in front of him. Varel's account, Crail's admission, the gallery records, Diana Ashworth's messages, Petra Holt's observations, the provenance irregularities, Meridian cultural assets, and the name I had obtained the previous night through a chain of contacts that I will not detail here, partly for their protection, and partly because the route was not entirely within the strict boundaries of the publicly available. The name was Gerald Sloane. Sloane was 63, a financier with interests in real estate, private equity, and more quietly, in art investment through several intermediary structures. He was not publicly known in the way that Crail was vaguely known. He existed in that stratum of serious money that operates entirely below the surface of social or business press. What I found about him came through regulatory filings, a single mention in an academic paper on money laundering typologies, and the very careful, partial account of my contact, who told me Sloane's name with the deliberateness of someone doing something they've decided to do and won't revisit. Sloane was connected to Meridian cultural assets through 2 levels of corporate structure. Meridian was connected to Crail through the passive investment fund. The chain ran Sloane, Meridian, Crail, Verrill Marsh, fraudulent provenance, clean money. And somewhere in that chain, the decision had been made that Elliot Marsh could not be allowed to go to the FBI. I presented this to Wolfe at 2 o'clock. He listened. He read what I had printed and what I had written. He sat with it for a full 10 minutes in the silence that means integration, the moment when separate pieces become a single structure. Then he began to speak, slowly and precisely, the way he does when he is not thinking out loud, but presenting thought already completed. Elliot Marsh discovered the provenance irregularities through the transaction files. He understood what they meant, not immediately perhaps, but quickly, given his expertise. He contacted Diana Ashworth, who had already told him that Crail had sought information through her, which confirmed his suspicion that Crail's purchases were not simply market strategy. He paused. He reviewed the files. He traced what he could. Not to Sloane, almost certainly, but to the pattern of movement and the false documentation chain. He determined that what he had found was not merely a clever collector, but a mechanism, a laundering mechanism. So he decided to go to the FBI, I said. He decided to go to the FBI, and he made an error, an understandable one, which was to contact Crail directly. Perhaps to give Crail the opportunity to come forward first. Perhaps as a form of warning. Perhaps to assess Crail's response. But by contacting Crail, he revealed that he knew, which information Crail could not keep private from those above him in the structure, because the threat was not to Crail alone. Sloane. Crail told Sloane. Sloane sent Decker to assess Marsh's intentions. Decker reported that Marsh was serious and moving toward action. The Saturday meeting, at which Crail intended to offer money, represented the last opportunity. He folded his hands. But Sloane did not trust Crail's solution. A payoff to Marsh might solve the immediate problem, but left Marsh alive with knowledge, which is an ongoing vulnerability. Sloane decided on a permanent solution. Decker, I said. Decker, acting on Sloane's instruction, not Crail's. Crail's Westchester alibi is genuine. He was not there, and had not ordered this. He may not have known until he heard the news Sunday morning. This explains his rapid agreement to meet us, his partial admissions, his visible calculation. He understood that Marsh's death had not been his doing, but that his fingerprints were all over the sequence that led to it. He's an accessory, I said. Not a killer, but part of the chain, which is why he cooperated selectively, giving enough to seem forthcoming without giving us Sloane or Decker. I looked at my notes. Can we prove any of this? Not yet. The corporate connections are suggestive, but not conclusive without financial forensic work beyond what we can conduct. Decker's identity is unconfirmed. Sloane is 3 steps removed from the gallery. He picked up the Miltoniopsis from the windowsill and returned it to his desk with the care of a man replacing something valuable. We need a confession, or something that functions as one. How do you propose to get that? By making it more expensive not to confess than to do so. He settled back in his chair. Crail is the lever. He knows that Sloane acted without his sanction in a way that has exposed him, Crail, to murder charges by association. Crail is an intelligent man, with significant legal resources, and I suspect a well-developed instinct for self-preservation. If he understands that his best protection now lies in full disclosure, he may provide it. You want to lean on Crail. I want to present Crail with a precise accounting of his situation, and allow him to draw the obvious conclusion. He looked at me. I need him here Monday morning, all of them. Crail, Holt, Ashworth, and the Verrills, if Featherstone can arrange Douglas's presence. What I'm going to do requires an audience. You're going to do the gathering, I said. I am. He almost smiled, which on Wolfe's face is a subtle event. Arrange it, Archie. Monday at 11. I picked up the phone and began making calls that I expected would produce a range of responses, from reluctant to hostile, and that I intended to make anyway, because Nero Wolfe had decided it was time to finish this. Getting everyone to the brownstone for Monday at 11 was the kind of logistical exercise that would have been impossible without specific leverage, and leverage is something I have learned to create. Petra Holt came willingly, because she was cooperative by nature and wanted the resolution. Diana Ashworth came because I told her, accurately, that she was in a position where appearing cooperative was substantially better than appearing absent. Constance Verrill came because she was the client. Douglas Verrill came because Featherstone, who turned out to share Wolfe's view that Monday's gathering was the key move, pulled the necessary strings to arrange a temporary release under supervision of counsel. Crail was the difficult one. I called him Sunday afternoon. He answered himself, which told me he was waiting for the call. Monday at 11, I said. Wolfe's office. He has a complete accounting of the corporate structure, from Verrill Marsh through Meridian Cultural Assets to the entity above it. He has Decker's name and the nature of his engagement. He has your Westchester alibi, which he intends to present as exculpatory. He also has a theory of how Saturday evening occurred, that, if presented to the police without your participation, leaves you in a substantially worse position than if you've been forthcoming with a private investigator. A long silence on Crail's end. What exactly is Wolfe's position? He asked. His position is that you didn't kill Elliot Marsh and didn't order his death, and that he can demonstrate this, and that demonstrating it requires your cooperation. Another silence. 11 o'clock, he said, and hung up. Monday arrived with the gray, specific light of a New York morning that has decided not to commit to weather. Fritz produced coffee and rolls and the particular atmosphere of a household that is prepared, and I positioned the office chairs to accommodate 6 people, plus Wolfe and myself, which required some rearrangement that I did with the awareness that Wolfe would notice, and either approve or not, and in either case say nothing. They arrived more or less together in the 11 o'clock window, which created a brief moment in the entrance hall of people who were connected to each other by death and money and proximity, pretending not to know what to do with that. Constance Verrill nodded to Petra Holt with the distance of colleagues. Douglas Verrill looked at Crail with the flat expression of a man who has had time to clarify his feelings and found them uncomplicated. Crail looked at no one specifically, which was a form of discipline. Diana Ashworth looked at Crail once, briefly. He did not return it. Wolfe came in at 11:04, settled into his chair, and surveyed the room with the contained satisfaction of a man who has arranged the materials to his specifications. I appreciate your attendance, he said. This will not be prolonged. I have reached conclusions which I will share, after which I will tell you what I intend to do with them, and you will each have the opportunity to respond." No one spoke, which Wolfe took as invitation to continue. He laid it out. Not everything. Wolfe knows what to present in sequence, and the sequence matters. He began with what each person in the room already knew: Marsh's discovery, the argument, the Saturday meeting. He moved to what some knew and others didn't: Crail's structure, Meridian, the layered fraud. He was watching faces as he talked, and I was watching faces as he talked, and the faces were doing different things. Petra Holt was listening with the focused attention of someone filling in a picture she had partially assembled herself. Diana Ashworth was still, in a way that suggested she had expected most of this, and was waiting for the part she hadn't anticipated. Constance Verrill had taken her husband's hand, not dramatically, but with the quiet intention of someone doing the one thing available. Douglas Verrill looked at Crail. Crail was looking at Wolfe. The man who entered the gallery Saturday evening, Wolfe said, did so using the door code. He had the code because Raymond Crail had been given it, and because the information had been made available to those managing the operation through Crail. He arrived at the gallery before Douglas Verrill and after Elliot Marsh. Marsh knew him, or knew the type, and was not alarmed by his arrival, which is consistent with a second visit from someone he had encountered before. He paused. One blow. Controlled, professional. The room was very still. "The individual I believe to be responsible," Wolfe said, "operates under the name Decker. He was engaged initially to assess Marsh's intentions and report them. When those intentions were found to be firm and imminent, someone above Crail in the financial structure, an individual named Gerald Sloan, whose connection to this operation I have documented, made the decision to act. Decker was the instrument. The decision was Sloan's." He looked at Crail. "Mr. Crail, you were in Westchester. You did not order this, but you were the mechanism through which Marsh became a target, and you were the mechanism through which Decker had access to the gallery. What happens next depends substantially on what you choose to do in the next few minutes." The room waited. Crail sat very still for a long moment. Then, with the deliberate movement of a man making a decision he has been approaching for days, he reached inside his jacket and produced a phone. "I have," he said carefully, "documentation of Sloan's directives, including the one issued the Thursday before Marsh's death." He set the phone on his knee. "I kept records, not for this purpose, for protection, my own, in the event the operation became a liability." A pause. "It has become a liability." "Yes," Wolfe said, "it has." What Crail's documentation contained, messages transferred through encrypted channels but screenshotted and preserved, was direct instruction from Sloan to resolve the Marsh situation permanently before the Saturday meeting. Not those words precisely, but words that meant those things to anyone reading them in context, and context Crail had preserved meticulously. I spent 20 minutes photographing every screen he showed us. Wolfe did not photograph them himself. He does not operate a phone. But he read each one when I held the phone for him. When it was done, Wolfe looked around the room. "Mrs. Verrill," he said, "your husband did not kill Elliot Marsh. He found the body, panicked, and left, which his attorney will address. The individual responsible is Gerald Sloan, acting through a professional he engaged for the purpose. Mr. Crail will provide the documentation to the relevant authorities, for which he will receive whatever consideration his attorney negotiates." A brief pause. "I suggest everyone retain counsel." Douglas Verrill said something quietly to his wife. She put her other hand over his. The meeting broke up with the careful movement of people carrying more weight than they'd arrived with. Crail left with his documentation, and the expression of a man who has accepted a specific transaction and its costs. Petra Holt left with the look of someone who will think about this for years. Diana Ashworth stopped at the door and looked back at Wolfe. "Will you need anything more from me?" she asked. "I don't believe so," Wolfe said. "You told Marsh the truth when it mattered. That is not nothing." She nodded once and left. I went to my desk and looked at my notes. and thought about Elliot Marsh, who had found a truth and tried to handle it with more propriety than the people involved deserved. Tuesday morning, Gerald Sloan was arrested at his apartment on Park Avenue by agents of the FBI's Art Crime Team, working in conjunction with the Financial Crimes Unit, operating on the basis of evidence submitted by Nero Wolfe through Saul Featherstone, who had spent Monday evening making sure the submission was airtight and the credit properly distributed. Decker, whose full name turned out to be Marcus Decker, former military intelligence, currently private, currently located through a combination of Crail's documentation and federal investigative resources, was arrested in New Jersey at 7 the same morning. Raymond Crail was not arrested Tuesday. He would face charges, his attorney and Featherstone between them having negotiated the terms of his cooperation, but the immediate liberty remained his. The charges, when they came, would be substantial: conspiracy, fraud, accessory after the fact to the degree a clever lawyer could argue it. He would not be going to Westchester dinners for some time. Douglas Verrell was released from custody Monday afternoon, following an emergency hearing at which Featherstone presented the core of Wolfe's findings and the prospect of Crail's evidence. The failure to report finding the body would be addressed in a separate proceeding, a misdemeanor matter, his attorney said, manageable, and Douglas Verrell would spend some time in a lawyer's office before any of this was truly behind him. But he would spend it at home. Constance Verrell came to the brownstone Tuesday at 2 o'clock and sat across from Wolfe and thanked him in the composed, careful way of a woman who does not use words lightly. She wrote the check, the remaining fee, substantial as promised, and left with the unhurried movement of a person who has recovered something important and is in no rush to jostle it. After she was gone, I sat at my desk for a while and thought about the case, which is something I do when a case is finished, and there's a moment to do it. Wolfe, I said. He was already at his book, The Byzantine Economics, finally moving through its final chapters. What? Marsh tried to do the right thing, went to Crail first, gave him a chance to come forward, tried to handle it decently. Yes. Got him killed. Handling things decently frequently carries risk, Wolfe said. This does not argue against it. It argues for choosing associates more carefully. He turned a page. He also, by doing what he did, created the chain of events that produced the documentation Crail preserved. Without Marsh's discovery and its aftermath, there would have been no pressure on Crail to keep records, because there would have been no threat requiring insurance. In a sense, Marsh's action, though it cost him his life, was the mechanism of resolution. I thought about that. That's a bleak way to look at it. It is also accurate. He looked up at me over the book, one of his rare direct looks, the kind that means he's actually paying attention to the conversation. Archie, accuracy and consolation are different services. I can generally provide one. The other is Fritz's department, which was, in its way, the most Nero Wolfe thing he had ever said. I wrote it down, not because I'd forget, but because it seemed like the kind of thing that deserves a record. Fritz appeared at the door to announce dinner. Rack of lamb with a tarragon sauce, preceded by a leek soup that he described with the quiet pride of a craftsman. And Wolfe closed his book with the deliberate ceremony he brings to that transition, the moment when the day's intellectual work ends and the day's sensory pleasures begin. I looked around the office. The bookshelves, the globe, the orchid on the desk, the 2 red chairs now empty, and thought about Constance Verrill's composure, and Douglas Verrill's face when he'd reached for his wife's hand, and Petra Holt's steady account of a dead man she had respected, and Diana Ashworth telling the truth when it cost her something to do it. Not a bad accounting, all things considered, for a week's work conducted primarily from a chair on West 35th Street. I followed Fritz toward the dining room. The lamb, I said. Yes, said Fritz, with satisfaction. And the tarragon sauce, naturally. In the office behind us, the orchid bloomed. The globe stood still. The files were updated, and the check was deposited, and Nero Wolfe had once again done what no one else in New York could do. Sat in one place and pulled the truth out of the air through pure relentless thought. I've worked for worse people. I've worked for considerably worse.